Hello there, good morning everybody. Good morning there. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is 7:40, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We've been talking about, hello Arnav, how are you? Good to have everybody in here this morning. We're going to jump right into it today, talking about the French philosophes. So we began by talking about a couple of important figures from England, actually, last time, talking about Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And Thomas Hobbes, remember, had a more negative view of humanity. He was the one who thought that absolute monarchy was the best form of government, whereas John Locke thought that he had a little bit, he had a little more forgiving view of humanity. He thought that, human nature is built on experience. He thought that, people were born free and equal with three natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and that the negotiation that people had with the government was to make sure that the government is protecting those three natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Now, remember that in his time, he's coming from a different social context. Today, we widen those, well, not just today, but for the last, really since the civil rights movement, these ideas of life, liberty, and property have been extended to all people, but in John Locke's time, it was one of those things where, because they were of a particular European patriarchal system, they didn't really view life, liberty, and property as being outside of the realm of white, land-holding, relatively wealthy, upper-class males. But today, of course, life, liberty, and property, the idea of government is to protect those three things regardless of whoever you are. But remember, these two guys came from England. These philosophes that we're now going to be talking about, and the one that we talked about last time was Voltaire, they came from France. Okay, so these major philosophes are 1700s philosophers, and I just want to make sure that we're clear on that when we talk about these French philosophes here, we're not talking about the ancient philosophers of, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle that we learned about in Unit 1. Those guys lived in like 300 BC. We're talking about these guys who lived in the 1700s, okay? So much more recent in history. And it's, the reason that we're talking about these guys, in order to put all of this into the bigger picture, is because the United States as a country is founded on the principles that these guys laid out, okay? United States history was founded on the idea of separation of church and state, religious toleration, meaning that people have freedom of religion and that the government doesn't make people believe a certain thing, okay, in terms of their religious beliefs. The idea that we have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, and I'm not saying that there aren't social construct limitations on this before Arnov jumps in and corrects me, okay? But because there are consequences for saying certain things, okay? That, you know, you can't just say certain things and not expect not to have pushback. But the idea that Voltaire says, okay, right here, I do not agree with a word you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Arnov, close one. Man, you crack me up, dude. Okay, so but the idea being that with a handful of exceptions that put the public in danger of being like trampled or of severely disrupting society, okay, you have pretty widespread freedom of speech. And I want to remind you guys that the freedom of speech is guaranteed to you by the Constitution of the United States. There's basically not a single other country, even ones that you would assume where freedom of speech is a thing, like, for example, Canada or Australia or something like that are really westernized and British settled as well. Even they don't have freedom of speech guaranteed to them by their constitution. So the United States, when we found the government, the blueprint for government, the original blueprint for government in the United States was a document called the Articles of Confederation, but they don't last very long because they were problematic. And very quickly it gets replaced by this federal government that is established by the Constitution. And of course, you know, the ideas that they put into that they didn't just come out of nowhere. They were inspired by these philosophers from France, these philosophes, who came up with these new ideas about, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on, being guaranteed rights to people by way of just the fact that they're humans, okay? The going back to the idea of life, liberty, and property with John Locke. And Voltaire's famous quote here, if any of you, I mean, it's pretty old. You guys probably don't even watch this show anymore, but back in the olden days when I was in college, there was a show called Family Guy. You've probably heard of it before. And there was an episode of Family Guy where the bank is about to take away Peter's home, or does take away Peter's home, and Peter walks in, and you know, he's like, "Hey, what are you doing in my house?" And this guy was like, you know, well, this isn't your house anymore because the bank said you're a big fat idiot and can't pay your bills. And then Peter Griffin responds to him, "Well, sir, although I don't agree with the words you say, I'll defend to the death your right to say it." All right. And basically, he's quoting Voltaire in that. All right. And so anyhow, you know, even in Family Guy and pop culture references, you'll see, you know, quotes from Enlightenment philosophers, which is really kind of funny. But anyhow, moving on to the next guy that we're going to be talking about here. His name is Montesquieu, okay? Baron de Montesquieu. And this is another French guy, okay? His name is very French. And he thought that England had the best government. And the reason that he thought that England had the best government is because by this point, England has the English Bill of Rights. They've already done the English Civil War by this point that we talked about and all that stuff. And by this point, England's type of government that they have is called a constitutional monarchy. A constitutional monarchy. France, on the other hand, had what was called an absolute monarchy. So just to talk a little bit about the differences between an absolute monarchy and a constitutional monarchy. Okay, so here's what, if you think about the word absolute, right? When we think about somebody having absolute authority or absolute power, right? That's kind of how the kings were in France at this time. The late early 1700s, the King of France was considered an absolute monarch. And And basically, like, you know, the King of France had a lot more power to control people in France, nobles and stuff like that, wage war and so on, than the King of England did. Okay, now Montesquieu, being a French guy, you would think that he would, you know, because England and France, they don't really get along that well with one another for a long time. You would think that most French people at this time would kind of have an inherent bias against English people, but Montesquieu, being a French guy, says that England has the best government because their monarch is limited by a constitution, okay? So in England, a constitutional monarchy means you still have a king, but that king doesn't have absolute power anymore. The power of the king is limited by a document, in this case, the English Bill of Rights, that happens after the Glorious Revolution when Parliament removes that one guy for being Catholic and replaces him with his daughter that we talked about. Okay, James II was his name. They replace him with his daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, and they basically, you know, they at that point determined that the king is not as powerful as Parliament is, and so the parliamentary nobles had a lot of power. Now Montesquieu was himself a noble, so it kind of makes sense. It kind of makes sense that Montesquieu would favor England's government because since he's a noble, if he was able to reduce the power of the king in France, it would actually increase his power as a noble in France, because the reason that England's king's power was limited is because the nobles had a lot of authority in England. All right, so Montesquieu comes out. He says one of the things that makes England's government really good is that they have three separate branches of government: a legislative branch, which deals with making laws; an executive branch, which deals with enforcing laws and handling the military; and then the judicial branch, which settles disputes about laws. Okay, so if there's conflicts about if the law is just or not, it goes to the judicial branch. So these three branches of government are what Montesquieu referred to as a separation of power. And of course, going back to this whole idea that I told you of why we're learning about this stuff, it's because these very same ideas were integrated into our own government as, you know, important elements to try to separate the power so that no one branch of government becomes more powerful than the other. All right, so we have a system of checks and balances in place. And recently, you know, in recent years, right, we've been living in what I would term a pretty strong executive branch term. President Trump has definitely extended the authority of the executive branch, but nonetheless, there are systems in place that limit the power of the president. And just, you know, going back to when we talked about the 12 tables in Rome, you know, when you write the laws down, remember what some of the ancient philosophers taught, okay? You know, what the ancient philosophers taught is that laws should be blind. That means that when they're written down and they're known to everybody, that means that no matter who you are, whether you're high up on the social chain or very at the bottom of the social chain, that the laws should apply the same for everyone. That no one is above the law, that the laws are written for the good of everyone, and that means that the law applies to everybody, okay? So he wrote this book where he says power should be a check to power. That means that basically when we take the government and we divide it into different sections, each of those sections should have, like if you think about the game of chess, if you know anything about the game of chess, you're trying to get the other king into checkmate, okay? And that means that the king, any position that he moves is going to result in the king being taken out, all right? And so, or in hockey, okay, I used to play hockey. If you check somebody in hockey, there's all kinds of checking in hockey, but basically you're not letting them just have the puck, you're trying to get them off of the puck, okay? You're trying to, in some sense, take away their power in the game, okay? And so when we talk about checking, okay, what we're really doing is, you know, or if somebody says check yourself or whatever, like, you know, what we're saying is that there's no one branch should be the most powerful. All the different branches should have different ways of checking the other branch's power to make sure that no one branch is more powerful than the other one, all right? And here's a drawing of Montesquieu. It's the best one I could find. Okay. The next one that we're going to talk about kind of got brought up in our last lecture, and his name is Rousseau. Okay, Rousseau. And Rousseau he's a later Enlightenment figure. He comes at the very, very tail end of the Enlightenment, and sometimes people say that Rousseau kind of bridges the gap between the Enlightenment and the next phase that follows, which is the Romantic age, the age of Romanticism, okay? But nonetheless, Rousseau kind of has some interesting ideas, okay? Rousseau thinks that the best form of government is a direct democracy, which isn't really very practical with the amount of people that live in the United States. We have 310 million people living in the United States. A direct democracy would never, ever, ever work. It's just completely impractical with that number of people. All right, but remember, he's living in a time where populations were relatively smaller and stuff like that. It's not that small, but anyway, Rousseau kind of has, I don't really know, Arnav, why my clock is off by, no, it is my clock. I don't know, I've tried to sync it and stuff, but I don't know why the clock is off on this computer. It might have something to do with the battery, I have no idea. Anyway, point being that Rousseau's ideas are a little bit hard to understand, okay? Rousseau's ideas are a little hard to understand. They're not exactly super, super straightforward ideas, okay? But basically the idea is that the government that governs the best, okay, the government that governs the best is a government that makes laws that take into consideration the needs of the majority. Okay, in other words, kind of here's Rousseau's ideas, and they're kind of conflicting. Okay, it's difficult to describe Rousseau. He basically argues that people will willfully give up certain privileges, okay, certain freedoms, if you will. People will willfully give up certain freedoms for the betterment of society. Okay, this is Rousseau's idea. He says that people in general, okay, act with more of a communitarian spirit than maybe they're given credit for. And that the government should be passing laws that apply to the vast majority of a population, not just the kinds of laws that are passed that are to the advantage of a select few. Okay? So Rousseau's ideas are kind of complex, all right, but basically the idea that, believe it or not, he thought that in some sense, in enlightened society, reason, science, and art can kind of corrupt the goodness in people. Rousseau's ideas are hard to understand because you would think that because he's an Enlightenment figure, all right, because he's an Enlightenment figure, you would think that he would be very in favor of spreading the Enlightenment as far as it can reach. But to be honest with you, Rousseau kind of says, you know what, when people learn more and more and more about society, it has a tendency to corrupt their views of society. And he says, but your average person who kind of just, is doing the best that they can and may not know a whole lot about how the government works or anything else, they're still nonetheless going to probably, advocate for a society that works best for most people. Okay, that people need to kind of believe in this idea of a communitarian spirit of a society where the government operates for the benevolence of or the benefit of the majority of the people living within that society. Okay, so again, Rousseau's ideas: people give up certain freedoms for the common good. Okay, that people will say, you know what, I'm not going to speed on the freeway, I'm not going to run red lights. Okay, now, of course, none of those things existed in Rousseau's time, but in modern day context, okay, we don't just go out and act however we want in public. We have a certain, way of acting in public spheres that are appropriate to society, that allow society to function without being super disruptive or dysfunctional. Okay, that people are willfully, able to give up just doing whatever they want at any given time, so that society functions better. Excuse me. So, that's kind of Rousseau's ideas. Another major thinker from this era is a woman by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, remember that the Enlightenment was, because of history, very male-based, okay? And that's an unfortunate fact in history, but it's just one that we kind of have to wrap our heads around, is that for a long time we lived in a very patriarchal society where women's voices were really not listened to, heard, or recorded down in history. But nonetheless, we do still have some examples of women who have contributed to serious, progress in terms of women getting educations and stuff like that. And Mary Wollstonecraft believed that women should be every bit as entitled as men to become educated in the Enlightenment. And so, women writers of her time should use the same principles of the philosophers to improve their own status in society. Because remember, women's status in society was considered lower than men at that time, and they were looking for avenues to kind of improve their position in society. So in 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a piece called A Vindication of the Right of Woman, and what she said in it was that, women should enter into male-dominant fields like medicine, politics, and stuff like that. And she's one of the first figures in history that we really see advocating for women to enter into these traditionally male-dominated fields. And in modern-day times, we can see that quite a bit of progress has been made there. If I was to be injured or something in a car accident or came down with some illness or something like that, I don't care if my doctor's a woman, a man. I don't care if they're black, white, anything. I don't care. I just want the best doctor, If I hire a lawyer, if I hire a lawyer, I don't care if my lawyer's a woman or a man or a black person or a white person or an Asian person or an Indian person or whatever. Okay, I just want the best lawyer, and so when we talk about modern day society, there has been some degree of progress where, and I'm not saying the job is over or anything like that. I think that there's always more progress to be made. Society should be based on the idea of continually trying to improve it, in my view, but the idea being that, we now do see women entering all the time. If you look across college campuses across the United States, women outnumber males at college campuses 2-to-1 a lot of times. So we have seen some significant forward movement, particularly in the last 50 years. And not saying it's been a whole lot of time, but in the last 50 years, we have seen a lot of forward movement. And it's a lot to thank to Mary Wollstonecraft and a number of other women in history who have advanced the position of females in society. And here's an image of Mary Wollstonecraft right there. All right, another major philosopher that we have to talk about is this guy, Cesare Bacharia. And he believed laws existed to preserve social order rather than to avenge crimes. So we've taken, in our modern day society, our prison system and other things have a lot of work to be done on them, but they are a marginal, at least, improvement on the way that crimes and sentencing and punishment for crimes was handed out back in the olden days. Back in the olden days, it was very common for criminals to be tortured, to have irregular proceedings where they didn't have any rights. They could be held in dungeons for ages. And then too, random punishments for things. Sometimes people's hands would be chopped off. Other times they'd be thrown in the stockade. Other times they'd be burned at the stake. There were all sorts of crazy random punishments in old school Europe. And Cesare Bacharia or Bacharia or however you say this guy's last name, he has like an Italian-French last name, so I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. He basically says that you can't just torture people. You can't have these irregular proceedings. That the law should work the same for everyone, okay, and that the criminal justice system should apply punishments the same for everyone, dependent on the crime that they committed. So if a person commits murder, one person shouldn't just get a slap on the wrist and then another person be executed. He said that the punishments for crimes need to be even for the degree of the crime that was committed. He actually didn't even believe in the death penalty. He wanted to abolish capital punishment, aka the death penalty. All right, he wants to get rid of it entirely because he thought that this was a cruel and unusual punishment. And again, this is yet another idea that gets written right into our Constitution. All right, that there should be a due process of law, that the law should work in a known, orderly way, the same for everyone, that people can't just be arrested for no reason and thrown in a dungeon and forgotten about for the rest of their lives, and also that their actual court proceedings, the way that the court is handled, that there are certain things that should happen in a particular order. All right, this is called due process, that the law works in a particular order and that order works the same for everybody and it's known to everybody. So, if people get arrested, you've probably seen on like Cops or whatever, or, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. The Miranda rights are a process now, a part of the process of due process. Everybody has read that. So that they know their rights before they enter into jail for being accused of a crime. Arnav asked me, Mr. Knight, do you believe in eye for an eye process of law? Arnav, I don't believe in eye for an eye process of law. The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth punishment are the same kinds of punishments that were doled out back in ancient times under the Hammurabi Code when the Ten Commandments were written. Okay, and I don't think that is conducive to a functional society because when we think about crime and who commits crime, the kinds of crimes that people go to jail for a lot of times are crimes that are a product of a particular social standing, okay, in society. That is to say that when people commit crimes, a lot of times, for a person who has everything, it's easy to avoid a life of crime, right? For a person who has money, for a person who has opportunity, for a person who has family, to support them, for a person who has an education, for a person who has a house to live in. These kinds of factors that we consider in this lovely bubble of Eastvale to just be how life works is not how life works for everybody across the board. And so you have to understand that when people get into desperate positions where their parents are addicted to drugs or they grew up in an environment where they're living on the streets and they don't have anything, they don't have any money, they can't afford anything or whatever, not to mention maybe they too have their own problems, mental illness or whatever else, okay, the threshold for crime drops. At what point does crime become a rational decision to be able to feed yourself or whatever else? Essentially what happens is you have certain segments of society who are really vulnerable and troubled and live very difficult lives, and to dole out eye for an eye punishments to people who had a particular set of circumstances, doesn't seem like a fair administration of justice. Jacob says, a lot of people in Eastvale are very spoiled and never experience the outside world. I'm saying, Arnav, that for a position that is, for a person who is in particular desperation, I think that crime becomes more rational for those people because you're of the opinion that your life is already so miserable that crime can't make it much worse. I'm not saying it's okay to rob people. What I'm saying is that if you put your mind into the head of somebody who is truly disenfranchised and lives a miserable life, that they're not going to have the same kinds of ideas about crime that a person who comes from a privileged place in society has. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, well, I mean, easy to say, right? Like, Arnav, it's easy to say you can be true to yourself. I mean, yeah, you have to be true to yourself, but identity is a big part of this, right? Easy to be true to yourself when you have a stable sense of self, right? What creates a sense of self but the environment in which you live, you know? I think there's a lot of people who have a pretty fragile sense of self, and it's really difficult to be true to yourself when you don't even know who you are, right? And I can point to all sorts of things that are examples of that. So yeah, I mean, yeah, Jacob, it really can be 100 times worse. I mean, here in Southern California, I'm not saying that people don't have issues, and I don't mean to minimize problems either of people who live in Eastvale, because it's not like everybody in Eastvale lives in a giant McMansion or whatever. People live in shared homes. There are kids who are in foster care, and there are people in our own community who are struggling. And it's just, I think the thing that's important is not to lose compassion for people just because they weren't born with the same set of circumstances that you were. Right, I think that's probably the number one thing to take away from it. Just and two, also the other side of that is not losing compassion, but the other side of it is being appreciative. Which can be hard to do when you get so used to living a good life, and when one little thing goes wrong, you let that whole thing wreck your world. The other thing that's super important, particularly for you youngsters, is to remember to be appreciative. And I know that comes from an old man like me, but I tell you what, there's nothing better in life than just being appreciative of the small things. And I don't even mean anything that might seem to you guys like that important. Appreciate the cup of coffee that you have in the morning. Appreciate the fact that you get to go home and hug your dog or whatever it is. Little things. Those little things are the things that make life better. Appreciating those little things and valuing them for what they are. All right. So now that I've gone on my little sermon there for a while, we'll move on. Talking about Cesare Bacharia. This is a picture of him. Other times things happen and it builds up, but other times it could be that it's just something that's small. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there, the other side of this is that there are other stresses that come from living in a position of relative affluence, right? There are other headaches that are created from that. You guys stress out about school and stuff like that, but imagine having a situation that was so miserable that you literally didn't even have the energy to focus anything on school because, you've got really bad things going on at home, or, whatever. It could be if somebody's sick or somebody is having problems or whatever it is. People have all sorts of things, and so, we can stress ourselves out about grades at school. We can stress ourselves about, I need to get good grades so I go to college. I want to be successful. And we wrap ourselves up in this whole identity built around that. But, boy, I'll tell you what, I'd take those stressors any day over, a parent who is sick, or, my family losing their jobs and we lost our house and now we're on the streets or living out of our car or something like that. When you find people who are in positions like that, you realize they got other things going on in their life that make the quote unquote normal life of Eastvale not attainable, right? And so the stresses become different. All right. So, legacy of the Enlightenment. All right, what's the big idea of the Enlightenment? Remember, the Enlightenment is an extension of the scientific revolution, okay? The Enlightenment is an extension of the scientific revolution. Both of them have the same spirit behind them. The spirit behind both of them is to try to make sense of the world according to known, predictable laws of nature. The scientific revolution is about understanding physics, astronomy, and then eventually things like medicine and various other branches of the sciences according to known laws, predictable laws that are understood by conducting experiments through the scientific method. The Enlightenment is trying to know and understand predictable laws of nature based on the human spirit, based on the human condition. It's trying to look at how humans best function according to the laws of the land. That is to say, government, the judicial system, natural rights, freedom, those kinds of things. Okay, so they're trying to create a society where people function better based on natural laws of society and how people operate best in society. Okay, but even though the outcomes are slightly different, they're still informed by the same spirit. Okie dokie. And the Enlightenment challenged very long-held societal beliefs. You guys have to understand, I mean, today, our current social times, we look around the world, the United States, Canada, Australia, basically all of Europe now, many, many places across the globe have adopted democratic styles of government. That includes Japan, that includes other places in Asia like South Korea and Taiwan and so on. They have adopted democratic traditions, okay? I'm not saying every one of them is exactly the same. Oh God, Arnav, will you stop flaming people? This is a class. Everybody has just as much right to do what they want, okay? So, all right, here we go. Now, the next thing here is encouraging reform, progress. We're trying to reform policies. The point that I was trying to make a minute ago is that it sounded like a flame to me, so that's what I'm shutting it down. Now, what I'm trying to say to you guys is this. Just listen to this and stop talking for a second. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is today we think of democratic societies as commonplace, okay? We think, oh yeah, there's a bunch of democratic governments across the whole globe, no matter where you look, all right? Yeah, but you guys have to understand that at the time that all of this was happening, there was no democratic government anywhere on the world, all right? So you have to realize that the whole reason that the democratic traditions of government, okay, it's the whole democratic tradition of government is born out of the Enlightenment, okay? It doesn't happen right away. It doesn't happen right away. A lot of these Enlightenment thinkers were still trying to make reforms within their current social systems, which were largely absolute monarchies. Basically, every single place in Europe is an absolute monarchy, with the exception of England, okay, all the way up for a long time into the 1800s, okay? Really, it's not until after 1914, even sometimes after World War II, that we start to see more democratic governments develop in the world. So democracy, worldwide democracy, is still a relatively young phenomenon, all right? They're making these ideas, they're coming up with these Enlightenment principles in a time where none of them existed, all right? And that's why it is important. The Enlightenment is a time that brings about the foundations for modern societies, modern governments, freedoms of speech, freedoms of press, freedoms of religion, the government protecting people's life, liberty, and property, and so on, and so on, and so on. All right? So, yeah, okay, Gareth, in Cuba, some dude told me kids like me would get kidnapped and nothing would happen. Yes, okay, thank you. All right, and that would have been a commonplace occurrence virtually anywhere on the planet. You could disappear, and that would be the end of it. okay? Or governments might just take you from your home and throw you in a labor camp somewhere, all right? And that was the last anyone ever saw of you. Or maybe it was you and your whole family. In history, these things happen. So it's important that we understand the Enlightenment as being a protection of the people within a society. And I'm not trying to say that it's perfect. Okay, you guys have to understand these are simply ideas that are trying to pave the way towards reform, pave the way towards progress, make society better, all right, over time, by guaranteeing certain rights to people. All right, so a more secular, non-religious outlook as well. Remember, in the 16 and into the 1700s, when this phenomenon was going on, okay, when this phenomenon was going on, the world was a very religious place, okay, and I'm not saying anything about like religion being bad or whatever. People's religious beliefs are important to them, all right, but the idea about religion being that it's people's personal own views, okay, that those views shouldn't be dictated by the rest of society, that those people's personal own beliefs shouldn't be dictated by the government, okay, that people should be entitled to believe whatever they want to believe, all right? And I'm not saying that that doesn't come with other social consequences, because government doesn't need to regulate everything. People will regulate themselves in a sense. All right, people have a tendency to say, look, we don't say these words anymore because they're hurtful and offensive to people, and if you say them, you look like a jerk. Okay, that's a normal progress of society that's going to happen. All right, the idea though being that the government, it's not the government's place to step in and tell people what they can and can't say or what they can and can't believe. All right, that should be an individual decision, unless they're doing something that is destructive or harmful to other people in society. When I say harmful, I mean putting other people in danger or for fear of their life, like yelling fire in a crowded theater or something like that is not going to be something that is considered freedom of speech, because if there's no fire and there's a giant, if there's no fire, hey, Arnav, I'm getting sick of it, so I need you to stop being distracting. Okay, so the idea is, in that situation, you're putting people into danger. Okay, and people could get trampled, harmed, injured, or killed. All right, and that is not going to be protected under freedom of speech, because you're now putting other people at risk. Okay. New thoughts on government, economics, science, the rights of human being, and this would eventually lead to the Enlightenment, and this is why it's so important, is because it eventually leads to two very important revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which very much break away from previous traditions that had been practiced for a very long time in Europe. Okay. Guys, we don't need all the extra commentary. I'm fine if you're talking to me, but I don't want comments in the chat that are distracting, okay? If you ask me questions and you want me to talk about things, that's fine, but I don't need extra commentary. All right, here we go. Thank you, Angie. I agree. Now, so let's talk a little bit how the Enlightenment spreads, okay? How the Enlightenment spreads. In France, at this time, it was illegal to criticize the Roman Catholic Church. That's what RCC stands for there, Roman Catholic Church. In France, it was illegal to criticize the Roman Catholic Church. Here's another idea. Censorship, okay, censorship. Here in the United States, okay, if you want to buy a copy of the Communist Manifesto, if you want to buy a copy of Mein Kampf, written by Adolf Hitler, you are able to buy those books and read them, okay? I am not necessarily suggesting that you do so, all right? I am simply saying that here in the United States, we do not allow for certain works to be published just because they're controversial or because they, are something that the government disagrees with. Censorship is another big important factor that fits into freedom of speech. In France, because it was illegal to criticize the church, Imagine, okay, imagine if if it was illegal to criticize the government here in the United States, okay? What kind of conditions would that create? If it was illegal to criticize the government of the United States, okay, that would mean that the government would be able to prosecute you, to put you in jail, to silence you, or whatever, you know, in some cases even worse, just for saying something bad about them, all right? And that would not be good because, you know, a free society is based on the idea that the government should be criticized. Go back up to what we learned about with John Locke here, okay? John Locke said it was the people's right to criticize the government if the government demonstrates that it is not protecting people's life, liberty, and property. Okay, it's a fundamental principle of John Locke's teachings that it is the right of the people to criticize the government, all right, and to take that government out of power and replace it with a new government if that government is demonstrating, all right, how do I do this? I forget. Put user in time. Boom. There you go. So, government's job was to protect these things. And if the government demonstrates that it's not going to protect people's life, liberty, and property, then the people have the right to remove that government, replace it with one that will protect it, okay? So as the Enlightenment spreads, okay, because it was illegal to criticize the Roman Catholic Church, this Enlightenment movement had to be conducted somewhat underground, okay? People couldn't just go out and publish and say anything that they wanted. All right, Enlightenment was spreading through books, magazines, and also word of mouth. And one of the ways that it spread was by these things called salons. Now, when we think about a modern day salon, a modern day hair salon or nail salon or something like that, people go to these salons and they have their hair done or their nails done or whatever. All right, but they also too talk and they gossip and they rumor and spread rumors and stuff like that. Okay, in these old school salons, they weren't going to get their hair or nails done. They were educational gatherings, typically hosted by women, for educated people to come together and share ideas. Writers, philosophers, artists, and others to come together, meet, and talk about some of these intellectual movements that were happening at the time. And one of the most famous salons that was held was by a woman by the name of Marie-Therese Geoffrin, is how you say her name, Marie-Therese Geoffrin. And she used to hold salons basically in like the basement of her home. And this actually ended up, she was very good friends with a guy that you may have never heard of before. His name is Denis Diderot. Denis Diderot is an important historical figure because he was the first to start thinking about this idea of creating a compendium of knowledge. Okay, a compendium of all of the teachings and understandings that were being learned at this time in something called an encyclopedia. And indeed today, think about how important Wikipedia is, which is a giant free online encyclopedia where anyone can go on and read something and learn about a particular thing. I can't tell you how many times I've just gone on Wikipedia and read articles to educate myself on something that I didn't know about before. But the first encyclopedia doesn't get made until 1751, which to you probably sounds like a really long time ago. But if we think about it, a person can potentially live at least to 100 years old. Okay, which means that if somebody was born in 1751, if they lived their whole life, they would make it to 1851. Another person born in 1851, if they lived all the way to be 100, they would live until 1951, okay? And then a person born in 1951, if they lived all the way to be 100, they would live until 2051. So we're really potentially here only 2.5 lifetimes removed from when the original encyclopedia was made. And that puts things in perspective for how recent a lot of this stuff was. People think of the 1700s as a million years ago. It really wasn't. There's been a lot of progress and change that has happened across the world in a relatively, in the grand scheme of things, short period of time, just a couple of hundred years, considering that humans have been on the earth for like, a really long time. So, Enlightenment and art. Okay, so European art, one of the other things that we got to talk about is that art is changing during this time. During the 1600s, the style of art that was most prominent was something called Baroque art. Baroque art was very, very grand, very elaborate, lots of sculptures, statues, lots of ornate design, okay? One of the best examples of Baroque architecture is a building called the Palace of Versailles, okay, the Palace of Versailles. Now, the Palace of Versailles is a very important building, okay, and it's going to come up several times throughout the rest of the school year. So I want to take some time to talk about the Palace of Versailles with you because it's going to play kind of it's only a building, really, okay. I've been there a couple of different times, actually. It's in France, all right, and it's about, I don't know, maybe about 10 or 12 miles outside of Paris, okay. So it's relatively closely located to Paris, but it's not actually in Paris. All right. Jillian says she's visited the Palace of Versailles. That's fantastic. I love it. Jillian, when did you go to the Palace of Versailles? By the way, my sister's name is Jillian. "2016. That's awesome. I love it. I would have been there right around the same time. I went to the Palace of Versailles for the first time, in maybe about 2001 or 2002 was the first time I went to the Palace of Versailles. But I just went again, I think, in 2000. I think it was the same year? No, it was the following year. I went in 2017. So just after you went there. But that's fantastic. Wow, what a trip. Were you able to appreciate it at the time? I mean, you would have been pretty young. Do you remember it pretty well, or was it cool for you, or were you kind of just like, this just seems like another old European building? Yeah, that's typically the case. I would say, so Jillian said, yeah, I remember it felt really cool, but I think I was too young to appreciate it all. Yeah, you know what? Even when I graduated from high school, I was about 18, and I went to Europe, and I took a trip around various places in Europe. I just didn't understand it that well. At the time, I wasn't as educated, obviously, and so I didn't know much outside of the United States or the hometown that I grew up in. It was my first trip anywhere really, and so I would suggest when you get older, not just you, Jillian, but all the kids in the class, as you guys get older and you learn more about history, boy, I got to tell you, there's nothing better in life than traveling, and seeing the rest of the world, and it really gives you a lot of perspective. Okay, traveling so important. Go around, travel, visit the world, go to different places, go to new places, and just absorb it and get a sense of somewhere outside of your backyard. Okay, so yeah, I mean, definitely if you get a chance, all right, please go and check out either the Palace of anywhere really, but yeah, Palace of Versailles is awesome. And there's, okay, so let me tell you a little bit, especially, to Jillian, because you went there, but let me tell you a little bit about why that building is so important. So the Palace of Versailles was built by a king by the name of Louis XIV of France. And when we were talking about absolutism in France, absolutism was characterized best by Louis XIV. He's one of the best known kings in all of European history. All right, and so because he's so well known, he creates this palace. Okay, he creates this palace that's this magnificent, and it's enormous, guys. I mean, I can't even tell you, it's huge. You can't even tour the whole thing. I mean, it's just enormous. You'd have to spend the whole day there to go to every wing of the palace, every room of the palace. They don't even let you go to every wing or room of the palace, but it's just huge, okay? It's just this massive, massive, massive palace. And Louis XIV built this palace, and he lived in it. But the Palace of Versailles is important for a lot of reasons beyond that. The Palace of Versailles played a big role in the French Revolution. By that point, the King of France, by that point, was a guy named, and that's what our next unit is actually, is talking about the French Revolution. The Palace of Versailles was the location where Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were taken from the Palace of Versailles during the French Revolution by basically a group of women, okay, female urban workers from Paris who went all the way out they marched to Versailles, 12 miles out to Versailles. They basically tore the whole building apart looking for the king and queen. They were going to kill them, but then they ended up taking them prisoner and brought them back to Paris. And that was the last time that a king or queen lived in the Palace of Versailles. Also, the Palace of Versailles is very important because that was where the peace terms for World War I were negotiated. The Treaty of Versailles. They negotiated the treaty at the Palace of Versailles in France at the end of World War I. So as far as a history monument, okay, the Palace of Versailles is a big, big, big deal in terms of its historical significance for hundreds of years. And today you can go and tour it, and it's a museum, and it's really, really beautiful and cool. But the reason that we're talking about it today isn't necessarily because of those things. We're talking about it as an example of art because it was a Baroque piece of architecture. And during the Enlightenment, we see this move, this change of the kind of art and architecture that's being produced away from this kind of architecture. This is the Palace of Versailles here. This is kind of the front courtyard entryway to the building. And this image only shows you a small fragment of the entire grounds of the palace. All right, it's huge. This is inside. So if you walk inside this door right here, there's a giant grand hallway right here called the Hall of Mirrors, and these are all mirrors. And back in the 1600s, when this was built, mirrors were like ridiculously expensive. To even have a small mirror would have cost a fortune. And look at how many huge mirrors there are here across the whole hall. And it was just, when people would walk in and see this, to you guys today, it probably just looks like, wow, it's a mirror. You can buy a mirror for $30 at Target, okay? But at this time, mirrors were priceless, and people would walk in and they'd see all these mirrors here, and they'd be like, oh my gosh, I mean, this place is just opulent. And of course, you can see all of the frescoes on the ceiling here, all of these crystal chandeliers that are, priceless, ornate, hundreds of years old, antique chandeliers, okay? I mean, it's really, really, really impressive to be in there. And that's just one room. And look at how many people there are here for a little bit of perspective. It's a big hallway, all right? And then here's outside the palace, all right? Still, you can see it's extremely, this is a huge garden. And by the way, if I was to show you on a map, okay, guys, like, let me just, for perspective here, because I don't even know if you guys knew that you could do this, but you can you can type in Palace of Versailles on Google, and you can go to, of course you guys knew how to do this probably, but you can go to Maps, okay, and it'll show you the Palace of Versailles. So just for perspective here, to show you where we're looking at, here's the front entryway, okay, here's the front entryway. That picture right there is looking at, it's taken from about right here, okay? So if we were to take this little man and drop him right about there, you'll be able to see, well, that's behind the gates now, but so let's go back. We'll move forward a little bit here. If we drop this little guy right here, Okay, there we go. Now we can see it. You can see here is, that's even closer up, I guess, but like it's huge, right? Like you can see here just how massive, all right, this this complex is, and this is only the front side of it, right? It's just huge, and you zoom in and you can see here more or less the same image right there that we're looking at. Whoops, all right, right? And if we go back, look at, if we zoom the map out here, how do I hide this? Here we go. All right, so if we zoom the map out here, here you can see the actual building. Okay, here's the actual building. But if we zoom the map out, the entire Palace of Versailles actually extends all the way back over here. There are these giant gardens that go all the way back. So if you drop the guy in the backyard, okay, back over here, you can take a 360-degree view look of just how enormous this palace is. All right, I'm sorry, it's kind of blurry there, but this is the back side of the palace, and it's just huge. Okay, it's absolutely enormous, and these gardens go on. Look at this guy. Okay. So anyway, they just go on forever and forever and forever, and it's a huge, huge, huge place. Okay, so anyhow, that's the Palace of Versailles. But the reason that we're looking at it is I want you to particularly look at some of the features here. You can see all these statues up here, these sculptures that are placed all over the place. It's very ornate. Whoops. Also, all of the gold, right? There's tons and tons of gold. It's very, very pretty looking, very grandiose, very opulent, okay, very ornate, and those things. Architecture changes during the Enlightenment era to buildings more like this. And you'll see here, again, a lot of these features that we looked at back in the first unit of ancient Greece and Rome. They start incorporating more pillars. You see fewer statues. There's still a couple of statues here and stuff like that. It's not like there's none of them. But you can see that the architectural design changes to have these pillars, the triangular pediment, also a lot more use of domes. This is Monticello. This is Thomas Jefferson's estate plantation that he lived on, and you can see here the pillars again, the triangular pediment, the dome on it. It's taking on a much simpler design. It doesn't look all grandiose and opulent with all the gold and other things that are in here. It's simpler, okay? They've got some flowers here and stuff like that, but generally speaking, no gold, no grandiose, fancy designs. Very simple designs, Greco-Roman inspired designs. But these didn't come from ancient Greece or Rome. These are new buildings. And you'll notice, too, that they look very similar to our governmental buildings. Mr. Knight, how come is that? Well, duh, it's because we're in the Enlightenment period, and the Enlightenment period was inspired by the same use of reason, the same use of understanding and creating a functioning society that the ancient Greek philosophers were inspired by. And so we take the architecture inspired by ancient democratic traditions, all right, and we incorporate them into the architecture that was being made thousands of years later in the 1700s when we built buildings here in the United States that would be serving governmental purposes inspired by the Enlightenment, okay? So, that gets us to where I wanted to leave off today in terms of the lecture. I would like to remind you, this is a unit that takes a whole lot of like reviewing who did what, okay? So it's going to be very important for you to go back and remember, what did Thomas Hobbes like? Okay, he liked absolute monarchy. He thought people were wicked. What did John Locke think? Okay, he thought people were reasonable and learned from experience, and he believed people had natural rights. What did Voltaire believe? He was big into freedom of speech, freedom of religion, okay, those kinds of ideas. What did Montesquieu believe? He believed in the three branches of government, okay, legislative, judicial, executive branches, each of them checking each other's power. What did Rousseau think? He thought that the best government governed for the majority, that people will give up certain freedoms for the common good. Mary Wollstonecraft thought that women should have the opportunity to become educated in the Enlightenment. And then Bacharia, He was the one who said that there should be equal punishments for equal crimes. He wanted to get rid of the death penalty because he thought it was an unusual and cruel punishment, and he thought that the degree of punishment should be based on how serious the crime was. Okay, you're going to need to remember what these guys do, and you're also going to want to remember what these guys back in the scientific revolution did. What did Copernicus do? What did Galileo do? All right, what did Francis Bacon and René Descartes contribute to the scientific method? Those ideas. Okay, and that's what your assignments have largely been around, is getting you to remember some of that stuff. Also, the idea that art changed from this Baroque style now into this new style called neoclassical, which was inspired by ancient Greco-Roman architecture with domes and pillars and stuff like that. All right, so these are going to be the kinds of things that you want to remember as we move into next week. And before I sign off here for today, I want to take a minute to recognize that today is September 11th. And for you guys who grew up in an era entirely after September 11th, you do not have a memory of that event, but I do. I was a senior in high school when September 11th happened. I was in the very beginning of my senior year. We had just started school. We used to start school after Labor Day. My birthday is September 2nd, so it was just a little bit after my birthday in 2002. I had just turned 18, and I was in high school that morning, and it was right about this time, right about 8:40 in the morning or so. Okay, but I was living in Minnesota at the time, so it would have been 6:40 California time. All right, so I was living in Minneapolis. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and went to school there, graduated high school there. I went to the University of Wisconsin for my undergraduate, and I was still in high school at this time, and we had 7 periods a day, and I was in my second period class. It had just started. It was an English class. My teacher's name was Mr. Harlan Marks, and the TV was already on, because one of the planes had already gone into the buildings. And as we started class, a second plane went into the other Twin Tower in New York City. Now, to this day, I have never been to New York City. I didn't really understand what was happening. I was still just a kid at the time. But it changed how the world worked for quite a while, really until very recently. We're only 19 years removed from September 11th. And, but it was a huge deal. There was a brand new focus on global terrorism that dictated American foreign policy for a long time. The United States ended up getting into some wars, maybe not exactly wars that were beneficial per se, with the war in Iraq and stuff like that. But nonetheless, there was a long, long search for terrorists and cracking down on terrorist organizations and things like that, the hunt for Osama bin Laden and so on, and it changed the world, and it was really significant, and it's only recently that I think we're now entering into a new generation, a newly defined COVID generation, a post 9/11 era that has started to develop in the last year here, as a product of the craziness of 2020, and there's some unusual political developments that have been brewing for the last several years. And so, history is always very interesting because it's always changing. So I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge the attacks on New York City that happened when I was just a little older than you guys are now, and say that, just again, be appreciative for the things that you have, because it could always be a lot worse. All right, folks. With that, I'm going to sign off for today. I want you guys to have a great weekend. I'll be posting the assignment here shortly on Canvas. Make sure that you do get that done by Tuesday morning and hand it in. And stay on top of what you need to do. I have a question on the assignment assigned on Wednesday. Are all questions answers in these slides? Not necessarily, although probably most of them are. I talk a lot about things. Oh yeah, for attendance, just make sure for attendance today, because I'm low on time right now. For attendance, just make sure that you log in. I want you all right now, if you haven't already logged into Canvas for today, I want you to log into Canvas for today, all right, for attendance, all right? And that will be how I take attendance today, because it tells me the last time that you logged in on Canvas. So I'll be able to see who was here and who wasn't here, okay? So go ahead and do that right now, and make good decisions, and have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you back here on Tuesday morning. Bye-bye, everybody.